Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the later 60s horror comics, or should we just go into the 70s?
Yeah, well, yeah, same thing sort of. Later in the 60s, you had stars like Bernie Wrightson and Richard Corbin emerging, who are still amazing artists working in the genre today. Marvel and DC were trying to do a real watered-down version of the old EC comics and the Warren comics, Creepy and Eerie, in books like House of Mystery and House of Secrets, where they were doing anthologies, telling horror stories, but they were real neutered. They were real, they were really safe for primetime TV sorts of things, and they're really done for children because Marvel and DC were selling to their superhero audience for the most part. The undergrounds in the 70s started doing the most radical, racy horror comics that had ever existed, more so than the EC stuff, more so than what Warren was doing. Skull and Slow Death were my favorites. These books being published out of San Francisco, not sold to the comic book audience at all, but mainly sold through head shops where people would go to buy their Robert Crumb comics and their stoner comics. They could also go get these really radical horror comics. Skull and Slow Death did topical horror, which was really popular in the 70s, and there was one issue of Skull. My introduction to H.P. Lovecraft mainly came from this issue of Skull that did one adaptation and a couple of sort of homages to Lovecraft. The weirdest stuff I'd ever read at that point, and it led me back to Lovecraft. But the undergrounds, they were very underground. They were black and white. They weren't available too widely. I was really lucky to come across them in the early 80s when I got them out of this guy that was selling pot in my hometown had a bunch of this stuff, and I got it away from him. And it was amazing, and I wanted more, but I didn't know where to find it. At the same time, some of that stuff from the underground was seeping into the mainstream with artists like Corbin getting more established in the mainstream. Corbin had done a lot of work in Skull and Slow Death, and then started doing a little bit more work in Heavy Metal, which was more of a science fiction magazine, but it still exposed him and his work to the mainstream and to fans of mainstream comics. But to me, the real watershed moment with horror comics was when Alan Moore took over Swamp Thing and brought with him, started working with these artists, Steve Bissette, John Totleben, and another artist named Rick Veitch, who was a little older than Steve and John. And Rick had been involved in the undergrounds. His brother Tom Veitch was one of the biggest writers in the undergrounds and worked with artists like Greg Irons and Richard Corbin, bringing this supercharged sexuality and just bizarre vision of monsters into mainstream comics. Swamp Thing brought about the revival of horror comics in mainstream Marvel and DC, with Marvel trying to imitate what Swamp Thing was, and DC expanding on it. DC, the publishers of Superman, were also the publishers of Swamp Thing, and the whole Vertigo line. The Vertigo line ultimately grew out of Sandman, the great comic that Neil Gaiman wrote. But Sandman only came about because of Swamp Thing. Alan, the writer of Swamp Thing, directly brought Neil Gaiman to DC Comics and brought him to comics in the first place, showed him how to write a script. And while Swamp Thing had waned by the time Vertigo launched, there would be no Vertigo without what Alan did in Swamp Thing. And that was really the resurgence of mainstream horror comic books.
Yeah. And in the 90s, there were no horror comics. No, I think Scott's entirely right. That really, has anybody here read Alan Moore Swamp Thing stuff? You guys all, that's good. Okay, and if you haven't,
yeah, it's the best horror comics. His American Gothic arc in particular is just like, it basically reads like a great horror anthology where each issue is just this amazing standalone story taking on some great part of the genre.